Andrew Meadows was the first employee to join Linden Lab in late 1999 and begin working with me on what would later become Second Life. Before that, he and I both studied undergraduate physics at UC San Diego. Andrew later went on to enter the PhD program in space plasma physics and left that program to join me in 1999 to work on Second Life. He's an amazing thinker, engineer, and co-worker who has worked with me for more than 20 years now. He's still at Second Life today after a spell in the middle of about a number of years working with me at High Fidelity. We had a wide-ranging conversation about the earliest days of our office in Hayes Valley in San Francisco, what the earliest experiences of Second Life was like, what the first avatars looked like, conspiracy theories in Second Life, physics, simulation theory, what we can learn from AIs, and a number of other fascinating topics. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Thank you.
Here we go.
Here we are. We're comfortable. We're good. We have our whiskeys close at hand. Cheers. Good to see you.
Good to be here.
So Andrew, the first thought I had was, what do you remember about us meeting and studying together in college? What class do we meet in?
That is a good question. It wasn't electrodynamics. It was one of the later ones.
I thought maybe it was 100 or electrodynamics. Professor,
the advanced electronics, perhaps, or the continuum mechanics.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what your experience was, but for me, as you know, I hadn't met anybody to study with, and I met you and our, 4 other friends, at the same time.
Right.
And
Chris, Phil, and
Dan.
Oh, yeah.
And Nick.
Right.
And for me, it was I'd always thought I was a really smart kid, but then when I got to college, started studying physics, I realized it was a lot harder than I had thought. And I met you guys, and then I was like, okay, now I really need to step up my game because these guys are super smart and they're doing all the homework, and I got to study, and I got to impress them, or they won't keep me.
When you say that, I feel like you're talking about Chris Mitchell, Phil Harris, and Dan Gilhard.
They were the smart ones.
They were the smart ones. I came in on the side. I must have become friends with Chris and Phil first, and they invited me into this.
I felt like I was the last to arrive. Yeah,
Oh.
I felt like you were all studying together in those first upper division classes, and then it felt to me like I had to try really hard because now it was going to get tough.
Yeah, I must have joined the circle before that because they were competitors at the lower division classes already. The scores would go up on a board somewhere. You could see who had done well.
Yeah, totally. I totally remember that. I mean, why did you study physics?
When I took high school physics, I really enjoyed the class. And it was at that time I decided on my major in college. So it's I came in, I knew, high school physics.
Things rolling down hills, or?
Yeah, the simple dynamics of projectiles in motion, force equations, of course, or equilibriums, and also electrodynamics, because I was interested in circuitry and whatnot.
Yeah, because like me, you were an electronics person, right?
I was interested. I didn't get as much experience as you did. But yeah, it always intrigued me. So it was a topic of interest.
I remember that was the class where I felt like I was ahead of you guys finally, because the electronics labs were classes where I would be like, oh, okay, this is my backyard. I can do this easily. And then Chris, I think particularly, was so good with the problems in physics. And then because he could get them, because everything was exactly correct, like
yes.
the theory and the math and everything clocked out, right? And then when you got into like electronics labs, you'd have like a weak battery or you'd have noise or whatever, and it wouldn't work. And I remember people in general would become super frustrated. And for me, I was like, oh, this is the part where I can really shine. I'm not going to have to work hard.
Yeah. And also there was always the uncertainty of measuring, on the scope where the line went. I remember, error analysis, early hands-on error analysis was a struggle.
Maybe that made us both embrace noise and uncertainty and craziness, which later on would come to matter so much with our work together. Did you like quantum or mechanics, or like what was your favorite upper division physics stuff?
I liked the mechanics and electrodynamics more than quantum.
Yeah.
I took, you take a successively higher level of quantum as you go, and
right.
Even, at third level quantum, I felt like I didn't understand it. So.
I think I felt about the same way. I mean, we had the same teachers, but it did feel a little bit like all the hoopla around quantum continues to kind of crack me up, because it feels like just the basic classical physics is plenty difficult and interesting, right, for everything. You don't really need quantum for much. I think we'll probably come back to that. That's great, Virtual worlds are a real example of that. Although I do remember, it's funny, I jump into Second Life, I do remember like tunneling objects, in Second Life. That was one of the things that was always really fun, because it was like the first signs of the simulation theory or whatever, right?
Right, yeah.
I remember, because we had all done all that physics and it was so fresh in my mind, when you and I, when we started working on Second Life together, I remember meeting with a venture capitalist, Jim Breyer, and telling, because I also worked a little bit part-time at that venture capital. I don't know if you remember that. At the very beginning of the company, I was still doing some stuff with Axel.
Yeah.
I was
you had a real part-time job.
Yeah, I had a real
on the side.
Exactly. I had the one-day-a-week thing where I'd drive down and hang out with those guys. And I remember telling Jim Breyer, I think it was Jim, that I had realized that when you try to simulate physics and you put a heavy thing on a table in Second Life or in any virtual world, most anyone, if you wait long enough, the ball will like fall through the table. One thing will come to another, And I remember being struck by that quantum-y idea that like, oh, well, you go to simulate virtual worlds and you've got these quantum effects that you get in the virtual world. That must be, and then the real world has quantum effects in it. You can push things through other things in the real world. And I do remember that being something kind of fun, where I was like, maybe everything is a simulated system, and maybe you always run into these artifacts, right, when you run in a computing
Right, exactly.
power.
Artifacts and glitches within the laws suggest that it's a simulation, yeah. Or the finite nature of quantum, the quantized values of the measurements. Yeah,
like I always thought about it more, I guess, somewhat because of Second Life, as that started to happen. I thought about how there can only be so much compute. Actually, that was a Feynman quote, right? Feynman had this great quote where he said, I refuse to believe that it can take an infinite amount of computation to figure out, right, what's going on in an infinitely small region of space. He's like, I hate that. It seems dumb to me.
Yeah.
We got to keep working on it. So it felt like quantum was, I would think of it as quantum suggests that there's a limit to the amount of computer. It's one way of looking at it, right? And that, there's also a limit to the amount of compute in any realistic systems that we're building for virtual worlds.
Yeah, and actually when we were first struggling with that, especially on the rendering side, I remember driving home and just looking at the fidelity of the world and realizing, contemplating how much calculation was going on and to create the scene for me.
Do you know what I used to do that with was because, we built things in Second Life with those primitives, and the primitives only had certain shapes.
Yeah.
I would find myself like going into like a cathedral or something and looking at it and being like, oh man, that's like so many primitives. Like you'd have to use a little arc there and then a ball. And, I was trying to like reduce everything to like compression, I guess. I was trying to reduce it to the minimum set of Second Life primitives that would represent it faithfully.
Yeah.
What do you first remember, like building in Second Life?
at the very beginning, you remember, I mean, we had to load terrain and we had to draw the avatar.
Yeah.
Right? And so the very, very first avatar was like...
The ball or the
no, it was a UFO. It was a spaceship.
UFO, yeah.
It didn't have any orientation.
That's such a great thing.
It just had position.
I thought I remembered then I wanted to put like a red light on one of the...
You had one. Yeah, there was...
So that when it turned, you could see which way it was looking because you could see which way the red segment was pointing.
That was added eventually. Yeah.
And then when was the flaming eyeball? Wasn't that similar?
Yeah. Well, as I recall, my memory was you were contemplating what the avatar representation should be like in the virtual world. And you had a theory that it should either be very abstract or very human-like, very realistic and, humanoid. And so we first tried the abstract case, which was it was an eyeball that had kind of flames on the back,
like an old car, like a classic car or something, Chevy.
So we would fly around and you could see where the eyeballs were looking. And
I think we did the big eyeball because we wanted to make it really explicit, so you could have this eye of Sauron, that was looking at you, and you could tell like, oh, that person can see me right now in the world. But I also remember wanting there to be no more to the avatar, I guess in sort of a Steve Jobsian way. I wanted there to be nothing more than the things we could control so that you weren't confused by having a right foot or something when you couldn't move your right foot and move the avatar. So like I had this idea, I remember, of it should be like a flaming eyeball. I mean, I don't know if you remember seeing this. And it should have this like grease gun hand, like you would have this little hand hanging from like a grease gun kind of thing, like in a car shop. And then when you went to manipulate things, with the mouse, it would like move the hand around to show you.
Yeah.
And we ended up settling on the power beam that went to the object, right? Like your hand would reach out and it would point at the thing and, convey it to change or whatever.
Tractor beam.
Yeah, the tractor beam. So let's go back, though. 1999, you gave up a very lucrative rocket launching space physics career to come down to Hayes Valley, San Francisco. So what was that decision like? What do you remember about that?
I'm not sure I would call it lucrative. It was promising, perhaps. We had data. I was studying plasma physics. And when you're studying plasma physics, typically you're either studying laboratory plasma or space plasma. And so I was on the space plasma side, so magnetosphere, ionosphere, effects. And
so you were shooting rockets, right, to measure those things like through the atmosphere.
Yeah, so I was helping build instruments on sounding rockets that would go up suborbital, maybe 300 kilometers or so. And they would pass through the magnetosphere, and you have waves and particles going up and down these magnetic field lines, so we would measure those. But it was actually in that experience, it was a lot of fun, but I learned that what I really liked to do was the engineering part and not the science part.
Right.
So that is why...
I do feel like I remember you saying that, that you wanted to build stuff.
Yeah, that's why I left. Reading the science papers was less interesting than building the instrument or writing the analysis code to look at the data.
What can you remember me saying about what I wanted to do? Like, what's your earliest memories of what the job was when you came down, I think in November of 99 or whatever?
Yeah, well, I had the advice that I had picked up from people that talked about how they got jobs in industry was to spread the word, tell everyone that you're looking for a job. So I started doing that, and I sent you an email saying, hey, I think I'm going to join the workforce. If you know of any jobs down there, let me know. And you said, yeah, I'm starting something. You should come down. I'm like, all right. So I scheduled a flight, and I arranged some other interviews for within a week. And I didn't know what you were working on, and I came down. But my idea for a career was to work in instrumentation. So building gadgets, hooking them up to the computer to measure the data. Just running like the front part of the experiment. and in particular working on someone else's project. I didn't want to invent the project, but if someone had a project that needed a gadget built, I would try to do that.
But do you remember, was I more talking at that time about building the virtual world or more about building the interface, the rig that we'll get to and talk about?
It was all about building the rig. So I came down, you had the rig, there was no mention about virtual worlds at that point. And so it was just,
yeah,
we have the circuit, measuring this thing,
yeah,
how to make it work. And I went through an interview. I think the only thing I remember about it was the circuit and the puzzle question.
What was the puzzle question?
The puzzle question was, you have a circular table and you're playing a game where you can lay down a penny or a coin.
That's so great.
Can you win this game? Is it determined?
So you have a circular table and you've each got a bag of pennies, an infinite number of pennies, and you got to lay a penny down flat, not on its edge and not laying on another penny, and you can stick it anywhere on the table.
Yeah.
And then you alternate turns, and the question was, is there a way to win this game?
And the winner is the loser is the one who cannot actually put a penny on the table, cannot fit a penny.
Right. That was such a great question.
Yeah, it was a great question, but I got it wrong. Because I didn't. You asked me, is there a way to win the game, whether you go first or last? And I said, I actually said yes, there is, and then I gave the wrong answer for the strategy.
Do you remember what you said? Was it not go in the middle?
Yeah, I said wherever they put a penny, you put one mirror image.
Oh, then that's right, but you just didn't say you got to go in the middle first, right? Yeah. I always liked that question, although I think as I've gotten older and more experienced, I think, all those questions are a little bit of hooey, like it's more important to figure out if people are going to be able to work with the other people there, than, more so than give them hard problems. But I did think that was a fun, hard problem.
Yeah. I don't ask puzzler questions anymore either. No? No.
What do you ask now?
I have a few standard C++ questions that I use to figure out how well they know C++, and then the rest of it is a conversation just to see how they engage.
Do you ask people about like networking anymore, or what sort of C++?
My C++ questions are simple. I can tell you.
Sort of list or something?
Yeah, they're 3 questions. They are...
we're outing you here now. You're not able to interview anybody anymore.
What is a virtual function? What is a pure virtual function? And why on earth would you ever use a pure virtual function? Those are the 3 questions.
Oh my gosh. This is not a job that I'll get.
Based on how they answer it, you can tell whether they're just a student, they've learned the concept but haven't actually used it, or whether they're very experienced and also just sort of how well they work with APIs.
What do you feel about where people went to school? Do you read that, or do you think it matters?
No, I don't pay attention.
Yeah.
I might notice it, as a thing that they actually went to school, but I don't pay attention.
So, what do you remember about Hayes Valley and that first office? That was really something. What do you remember most when you think back to the neighborhood and where we got lunch, or the experience of Hayes Valley, 1999 to 2003?
It was an interesting time because it was the dot-com boom of the late 90s was still in force at that point. So this is late 99, November or October.
Right.
And there was a frenzy in the neighborhood. You just saw it, all the people that you talked to, the traffic on the roads, the fact that you never saw a for rent sign anywhere in the city.
Yeah, the traffic.
Yeah.
The traffic on 101 forever is the metric of Silicon Valley's prosperity.
Yeah. And the ads that we saw on TV about all the hyped, internet possibilities. And so it was an interesting time. And so I came down and there was this fever going on in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley. And so it was when I came into your office, the main thing I remember is I still smelled fresh paint You guys had just painted the place.
Painted the office.
And there are all these guys running around. There's some guys upstairs, as I recall.
I have to say that the story, at least those few months before, was that my niece was helping out at that time. She was a teenager. You remember her. And she looked up in the paper, and I remember her saying to me, "Uncle Philip, what is a shell condition warehouse?" And I have to say, I didn't know what that was either, but it was like 50 cents a square foot for that whole, for that whole building there. We were in that 3-story little warehouse basically, but I didn't know what shell condition meant, and I didn't know what a shell condition warehouse meant. And of course, you and I found out what it meant, which was a bathroom that was not serviceable, and the ability to lock oneself permanently into the cage between the front door and the outer. That was the one that really made me laugh, right?
Yeah.
Like if you had pulled the door closed behind yourself, you could potentially have locked yourself into the space between that door and the
outer gate,
metal gate, and you would have been stuck in there like a zoo animal for the remainder of the night or whatever. Back in those days, we didn't have as many telephones to get help with, but I do think I remember that. What else? Yeah. What do you remember?
It wasn't well furnished. I mean, it was just like a couple tables and a big empty space, and you had.
But we had the conveyor belt.
The conveyor belt was there from the first floor to the second. Yeah, you could turn that on and ride it. You could ride it up, but not down.
Yeah.
And you had construction lights. Shining
in the corners.
Yeah, just
I love those.
Those lights that you would shine up in the corners.
Yeah, like paint construction. They're like those yellow construction
lights.
Nice
industrial.
I liked having them in the corners that's just great. I didn't remember that. And then it was, we would both ride our motorcycles in the morning. We're both earlier people, so we'd usually be there.
I remember coming in at 5:30 in the morning, and you were already there.
Really? At 5:30?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
One day.
Maybe once.
And one of the great things about that time was this is my first real job other than grad school. And I had some side jobs, but it was my first career job. And I would wake up in the morning and I would pop out of bed and I'd be like, I get to go to work. I'd run off to the city. Yeah.
So the first thing we built was the rig, which has been not much discussed, although there's a little bit about it online. And then as you know, we've been working on it a little bit in a project here at our lab. But what was the rig? How would you describe it?
The rig was, at its simplest, it was a simple transducer that measured force. And then with visual feedback on what that force was doing on the screen, you would get a visceral sensation of the weight or the mass of things. So at its simplest, it was that. And
we had like a beam, right, that you'd hold on to and play pong with. And the beam had strain gauges on it, and you couldn't move your hand, but of course you'd see this little paddle moving around, right?
Right. Yeah, so you're pushing and pulling on this rod that doesn't move, and yet you by pushing harder or less hard, you could move something faster or less.
Yeah.
But at its most complex, it was just a measurement. It was going to be, the plan was to make a measurement of your intent of motion,
right,
of the whole body.
And what do you remember? Like what's the coolest thing that we got done with that? Before we shelved it and started working on Second Life, the software, basically.
Well, we had it hooked up to your head, and so you could kind of look around in the world just by trying to turn your head, and then the world would swing across your vision. We also had both feet. You could strap both feet in, and we could measure the force on your feet, and you could kind of move your legs in an attempt to walk.
And the point of this, dear listener, it was that the idea was that we would immobilize you, and like, for example, keep your head from moving, and then feel how hard you were trying to turn your head and turn the display that you were seeing, so to speak, turn where you were looking in the world. And our hope was that we could build a VR headset, if you will, without having to have light things attached to your body. And so it was this almost opposite idea that instead of letting you move and tracking how you were moving, we would not let you move,
right.
and we would track how you were trying to move. And as you know, I mean, it's still I think still an interesting research area, although it's a more expensive way to do VR because you're building a big contraption. But it could also simulate things like holding a sword because you had to generate exactly the right forces, or holding a bowling ball. I remember we'd have like you hold something heavy in your hand, and if you didn't push up against the thing that you were kind of bolted into, the thing, your hands would fall, and so you actually felt inertial
your
mass.
visual hands would fall.
Yeah.
So you'd have to use the visual feedback to hold the ball correctly. Well, in the full the full body rig idea, it is interesting, but it's really a complex problem. It turns into a
do you think
difficult mechanical problem.
Do you think it can ever be solved? Like, I wonder, do you think if we put more time into it, we could figure out how to throw a football or something without moving your real arm, but like we were kind of working toward?
It would be hard. I think you'd have to sort of step up the experimental lab and the fabrication of the device.
There's a nerdy thing about it that I reflect back on, because I think at the time we talked about this, which was that if you remember, when we would restrict, say your arm from moving, we'd have all these degrees of freedom that we restricted, mm-hmm. like your shoulder's got like 5 degrees of freedom, and then your wrist has got, more, and the problem we had, if I remember, was that we'd be sensing all these mechanical channels, which were basically strains that you were putting on the metal that you were kind of strapped to. But then we had to infer from that, kind of which muscle was pushing on which bone as a means of moving, your avatar's arm the way you were trying to move your own arm, right, with these forces.
That's right.
And if you didn't have the math right, you'd move one way and your virtual arm would move the other way. And I remember that we had all this like physics discussion about, could we do formulas that would take out all the side, all the coupling, the coupling, right, between channels. Nowadays, we would just do that with AI, right?
Yeah, with enough data and a fancy enough rig, you could do it.
Yeah, it seems like that's that's one thing. I agree with you. I think there are other like big problems with making something like the rig actually work and making it affordable, making it usable. But it does seem like AI now, it seems like a perfect example of machine learning. You just sit there and go, I'm trying to lift my hand, I'm trying to lift my hand, I'm trying to lift my hand. And then it'd be like, okay, I got that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But remember, we had it such that if you shifted your weight, it would,
right.
You'd get measurements. So in that sense, it was coupled to where your torso was.
Right. So like even if you moved your butt, it could think you were moving your forearm, basically.
Right.
Yeah. So many problems like that in VR. It's amazing to think that we've gone 20-some, about 24 years after we were doing that work, and things are still harder than we would have thought. Obviously we've worked together.
Yeah.
Almost the whole time since then. So it's fascinating stuff. It's great.
One of the things I remember about the early days is that I came down to work on the rig or on the instrumentation problem, and I was working on it for a week before I found out about the virtual world aspect.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, we went to lunch one day, and over lunch you were saying, oh, yeah, once we get this rig working, I want to make a virtual world that we can use it in, and then it'll be a 1-2 punch.
And what do you remember? Do you remember what I was saying about that virtual world?
No, it was just going to be a space where you could actually use the instrumentation, the machinery, or the input mechanism. And I was excited. That sounded like a lot of fun.
I always have these memories. It's kind of funny because I know that you've always been very thoughtful. Maybe we'll get to that about separating kind of, physics from religion or anything like that. And it was interesting how we were like, having these conversations or these kind of recapitulations of the book of Genesis, right? Like simulating water and ripples on the water first, and actually connecting, I think, to our friend Chris's computer down in Los Angeles, where I think he set up like the first time we actually ran a simulator that was not in the office, was to make waves go back and forth between two, water areas, basically. And we had those waves that worked at the beginning.
Yeah, we exchanged boundary conditions and propagated the drum equation. Yeah.
I remember that we would set the water, the water always had a little bit of wiggling, a little bit of noise in it, of course, and it seemed to never go away, which we found fascinating. And then you'd sometimes go home and you'd come back in the morning and maybe it was totally calm, or maybe it had become
gone unstable,
and it was like, huge waves.
Yeah. The problems of simulations in finite time.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like we had all these weird, like, very beginnings of a virtual world moments, where we added the sun. Yeah, I remember that because we wanted to see reflections on the water, because specular lighting was just so cool, especially back then, 2000. So we were using OpenGL for everything, right? That was the...
Yep. And there was a few years where every week or every month there was something new added, and that was always a lot of fun.
Oh, added like
just add new features added, So things were moving really fast.
So we started working. Oh, the other thing I always remember is I always called it like the garden. I always talked about like, I want this huge garden, this huge primeval garden or Garden of Eden or whatever, that like this garden, but at the scale of a planet, and you could just wander around. The one thing I can remember is saying like, well, realistically, maybe nobody would like to pay for that. Like, we had to figure out, how to build a startup. But I remember just like being enticed, and I still am, by this idea of like a really big garden that had complexity, that had some kind of physics and stuff evolving in it or whatever.
Yeah, AI life. You would come back a month later and it would be different. Things had grown, maybe land had eroded. Yeah, natural environment with sort of dynamic content.
We got to come back to that later, because I think that question of like, how do you do, like, how do we build physics that makes an interesting world? Maybe we'll save that for the end. There's so many good different things to talk about. But like, what are your earliest memories of like Linden World, which was our first pre-beta version of it? And of course, I remember James made that video, "Welcome to Linden World," which is on YouTube, that you can go and see.
That was made years after.
Years after, but it was a pretty good. He was going through the feature set.
Oh, it was fantastic.
The grenades and the water. It still had that still had Ripley simulated water. I think Linden World. We hadn't turned that off yet, and the trees would blow with the wind. All those, so much of that simulated stuff we had to take out as we tried to get to something that would run on computers of 2003.
Yeah, what I remember was that was the original idea, was a garden or just a physical world that you could be in that was digital. But we were, struggling to figure out what is the minimal viable feature set that we could launch with. Yeah. And we were constantly asking that question, every week, every day. And so we were, and by then we had more people. And so it was sort of, everyone was contributing as to what that minimal set is.
And what do you think, like, when did the minimal set emerge? Or what happened with that?
Well, there was a big transition on our direction, was that day that you had a investor meeting, a board meeting
board meeting, I think.
And so we were going to do a big demo for the board. And the plan for the demo was, as I recall, you and the board were going to meet upstairs, and you were going to show them the world.
Right.
And then you were going to leave the projector on, or the screen on, and the 6 or 7 developers down below would run around and build stuff. So at that point, you could plop down a prim, stretch it, and apply a texture. Yeah. I don't think you could link them together.
No?
I'm not sure.
Was there physics? Could they fall? I can't remember.
No, just the avatar was moving around, as I recall.
Yeah.
But So we did that. You did your presentation. Then there was that moment where we were running around just building stuff, and it was a lot of fun at that time because I had never, the tools were new. Being able to just put down whatever texture you wanted, so I could upload my own textures. And so we went around and built a little town. I remember I built like a gazebo and some steps, and we were running around trying to build stuff as fast as possible. And what happened was people would build something cool, and then someone else would come along and add decorations to it or modify it slightly or make some sort of riff on the content.
Well, those what I remember was the snowman and the great snowman, and then the tiny worshiping snowman.
Right. Someone had made a snowman, and then someone had come by later, someone else, and had built a bunch of little snowmen that were bowing to the giant snowman god.
That's the one that I definitely do still remember, like looking at that on the screen. Right. And then we all had this moment where we were like, oh, this idea of building collaboratively or whimsically, right? Like the fact that the system minimally enabled that, we were all like, okay, that'll be cool.
Yeah, it was.
That'll be something to do.
So the idea of just give people a place to build cool stuff rather than work hard on, say, making birds and plants grow dynamically, or eroding the terrain and having weather. We still wanted it to be physical, but user-generated content was there was a big swivel at that point.
There's always this tension, and I think there still is, right, about like the idea of being part of a world whose rules are inviolable, and that there's like some charm to that, like to figure out how to, knock over the big rock, you got to get a big, lever arm or something to do it, right? Versus the idea of your world, your imagination, our launch tagline for Second Life, that was more this idea that you were in complete control, you were a god, and you could do anything you wanted. Mm-hmm. I think that's still this unresolved thing, like virtual worlds of today even still veer more like Second Life did at the start in the, you can do whatever you want, there's a button for everything, we'll give you a knob for everything. And I think there's something that we never got to, or that I never got to, that I wanted still, like you said about like, there really are laws of physics and you can't break them. And part of the fun is that. I wonder how that'll still shape out,
Yeah, well, when we were a startup, we were trying to balance the burn rate and the delivery of something that people would use. So there's this practical side, but I still am fascinated by the ideal virtual world, that's far more interactive, or at least, is based on very small, simple rules, but otherwise, completely open.
Yeah, I mean, that one's such a fun one, right? Like small, simple rules. I love automata and simulation and, finite element systems and all these types of systems. And I think like one of the problems that I know I thought about early on with Second Life was that I always call it the trillion problem, right? Which is like, if you have laws of physics that animate little particles or whatever in some interesting virtual world, like Prims in Second Life, then the question is, well, how many of those does it take to build the first interesting emergent thing, right? And in the real world, right, it's atoms, and then the next interesting thing, so in some sense, is the cell, right? Is the cell, single living cell that can reproduce itself, right? And the answer is there's like a trillion, unfortunately, there's like a trillion atoms in a cell. There's just an enormous number, that's what, 10,000 cubed, right? So it's just this huge number. And then there are a trillion, more or less, cells in a person. So if you build a virtual world and you have some physics and it works, right? The problem is you've got this trillion, 10 to the 24th of the smallest units might be needed to make something like us, right?
Right.
And I think that there's still this like intellectual problem. I don't know if it's a good business problem, right? But an intellectual problem of how is there any way to build the small parts so that you don't need a trillion of them to make the next interesting emergent scale like up?
Yeah, I don't know if that's possible. Optimistically, I think it is, but I don't know what it looks like.
As a physics person, right, like, what are the sort of shortcuts, right? Like, yeah, if you're optimistic, like, how come? Like, how could we find a way?
Well, you know that complex behavior can fall out of just a few simple rules, right? So you could just specify...
Game of life, right.
Yeah, you could specify a small but not infinitesimally small minimal size. Maybe it's only a millimeter squared, or maybe only a centimeter squared.
Right.
And then you just need, optimistically, I don't know what the rules are, but you need a few simple rules on how these things interact and bind together.
Have you followed any of the artificial life playgrounds that people have played with some now with balls and springs? And our own Jeffrey Ventrello went on and has done some really wonderful work in that, where he's got things with balls and springs and forces and stuff that create really interesting little creatures and stuff.
Yeah, I haven't dug in too deep. The last time we played with it was actually at High Fidelity. Remember, there was a period where we were looking around at all the interesting...
Right. The Atomic Garden or whatever.
Yeah.
Trying to read. That's right. I never get away. I can't let this matter rest. I'm always got to work on it. And at High Fidelity, right? We worked on it also. Our second attempt at all this. So, one thing I remember was the first avatars, and we had that contest, and you won. You were, I should say, Leviathan. What do you remember about that contest?
The contest was to just see who could make the best avatar. This is right after we got all the, the adjusters that Richard did.
So all the different sliders for the body, but we also had attachments.
Yes,
because
that's right.
Your winning entry used attachments. But
right.
Yeah, I think we had that you could attach primitives to the avatar itself, and then you had all the sliders on the avatar, and you. Well, it was one day, right?
You could put attachments on, but you couldn't just drag them wherever. You had to specify the position and the rotation.
Like manually?
You had to manually type them in. And so what I did was...
It was a mathematician's game to be won.
I just spent hours into the night, carefully adjusting these the positions by trial and error to get the attachment to where I wanted them.
And what did you make? Tell me what you made.
Well, I didn't want to make a pretty avatar, so I made a guy that looked kind of rough, like a kind of
like a
Viking warrior.
Warrior, right?
And I think I put armor on him and gave him a sword. Yeah. But there were other very creative entries. Like someone made like a Kirby avatar.
I do feel like I remember that.
Yeah, and that one was neat.
And of course, that was the history of my avatar, which was, I always retell this story that we were doing that contest, and I knew that I wasn't going to win, and so I was like, well, at least I should do some dumb thing that will make everybody laugh. And then I used Photoshop, and at that time, as I remember, I didn't even really know how to use Photoshop, but so I was like, okay, I'm going to load up a pair of chaps or black leather pants, I think, in Photoshop. And then I'm going to figure out how to use like the opacity brush or whatever. And I'm going to paint away the crotch and the ass of these pants and leave myself with like this naked mannequin underneath and then leather pants. And I was like, well, that's kind of cool. And then I built a whole avatar around that, which was Philip Linden, basically.
Spiky hair and the handlebar mustache.
And red, like I had yellow eyes, the very first one, and the hair was like kind of reddish, whatever. And later I put on a tattoo. I don't think we had tattoos. Remember how the avatar's body was mirrored on both sides in the earliest thing? So you couldn't do a tattoo that was just on one arm because it would show up on both arms.
Oh.
I remember that. And then at some point we, fixed that by like adding another texture for the other side or whatever.
But that's the kind of optimization you'd make on a game initially,
Yeah.
One arm's the same as the other, just flipped.
I bet people don't even understand, like, it was so long ago then that it was so amazing that we could make such interesting things, objects and avatars and stuff, right? Because a lot of our challenge was like the physics and the compression of how to represent all this stuff with very little information, because of course the internet was much, much lower at that time. I think I wrote on our original design document like 100 or 200 kilobits per second.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, that should be enough for anyone. That'll be amazing. So you won that contest. Now, Leviathan, you also had the name Leviathan. What was the history of that name?
Leviathan is my middle name, chosen middle name.
Mm-hmm.
So
got it.
Originally, I had a different name, and then when I got married, my wife and I decided to pick rather than she take my name or I take her name or do a hyphenated thing, we decided to pick a third arbitrary name. And turns out that's actually kind of hard to
pick.
Yeah, we literally went through the phone book. We had phone books back in those days. So we go through the phone book,
That's
look for
right,
names.
Children. It was a large yellow book or a white book. A white
used
white
to
book.
be for the phone look up people's numbers. You had a phone book. You could look them up. So to pick a last name, you're kind of joining. In some cases, you're joining in an ethnic group that you don't belong in. There were cool names, but they belonged to
somebody. Kind of felt like they belonged to somebody else. Yeah.
And so I remember one of the names I really liked as a last name was Diamante. That was Italian.
Diamante.
Yeah. And,
yeah.
Like I'm not Italian, but
you'd like to
could
be a Diamante. Yeah.
So this is involved in the name Leviathan because I had decided Leviathan would be a great last name. I could be Dr. Leviathan because at the time I was trying to get my PhD.
Out of Marvel. Yeah, Dr. Leviathan. It's like a
James Bond villain name or something.
And then that didn't work with your wife.
Yeah, she nixed that. But I was so enamored with the idea of Leviathan as a name, I said, okay, I'll pick Leviathan as a middle name.
Uh-huh.
So Leviathan is my middle name, and I had at the time of the contest, I had a character whose last name was Leviathan. Remember, in Second Life you have the last names.
Well, that's what I was just going to say, right?
Yeah.
Is now you're like, did your own choice, this process of choosing your own name, right? It preceded our design for last names in Second Life. So that's like, think about how cool. I've never even thought about how cool that is, that you also chose a new, bespoke, chosen name.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's like an interesting segue into like, one of the early things about Second Life was we needed people to have names. And what I remember was I wanted people to be able to have their first names because like that's the thing that not everybody, but that's the thing that a lot of people are very comfortable with. But I kind of felt like we shouldn't really have to have one, you should be able to be pseudonymous. And two, it'd be kind of cool to be able to pick your own last name, right? Because you could stay with your first name, then you could pick your last name. And so then we did that thing where the Dunbar number, in the beginning we would pick last names and only use them 150 times, and then we would retire them.
Yeah, right. I think it was around 500 people we would retire them. But then we had to keep coming up with new last names, and people would use up the last names and then leave. And there'd end up only being, 4 or 5 people that stuck around with the original last name.
I remember that when Second Life started to have like thousands of people a day signing up, we would all be like at lunchtime, like there was like a spreadsheet or something where we would all try to come up with as many new last names as we could.
Yeah.
And we'd go from there. Yeah.
And it was a weekly thing. Yeah. Come up with 20 last names for the next wave.
If you had it, other virtual worlds, nobody ever used a system like that. Like, I wonder why. It does seem, I don't know, it still seems like a good idea. And it seems like something that, maybe as virtual worlds grow, people will kind of have to come up with or try.
Second Life moved away from that, right? And so feedback from the community was that people didn't want to have last names.
Yeah, they wanted to
And
have
so-
one name as one
Yeah,
string.
they just wanted that you have their username, and the last names were.
Although I think there are some people in Second Life who still really like
Yeah.
the last name thing, myself included.
Well, there was a period, as I understand it, there was a period where we didn't let you have a last name, and so it became an indicator for people who were old bees versus newbies.
Right.
And so it was sort of like the star-bellied sneetches thing, or something like the haves and the have-nots. And so I think they brought that back so that you can have last names in Second Life again.
That's what I was about to say, was if I recall, of course somebody's going to correct us or inform us on here. That we did bring it back in some sense. But the other thing that I remember that was so cool about that, right, was that thing where there's so many things we've all learned about community and about how behavioral dynamics work. And as I've said many times, like you, I was interested in physics in the beginning, and I kind of wasn't really all that interested in avatars. We talked about the giant eyeball and stuff. But then I got more and more interested in them as I saw the effects that, different choices that we made had on people, and that, there were many ways to have very positive effects on people, and that was a great thing.
Yeah, the ability to express yourself with your avatar.
But that idea of like choosing your own family, basically, that you'd pick a last name and it was this chosen family or chosen community. And then when you'd run into somebody in Second Life that shared your last name, you'd feel this bond to them.
Right.
Even though I suppose they were someone who minimally had no more in common with you than that they liked that name, and that, both yours and theirs was available.
Right.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of things like that where we were trying to, we had restrictions or limits like that where we were trying to encourage people to interact and form friendships in the world.
Yeah.
There was the last names where we thought there would be some kinship, but also remember we were worried about there being a sort of a desert where people couldn't find each other. So we wouldn't let them fly very high. We tried to keep them down at the surface. We wouldn't let them build arbitrarily high. And also, you may remember, we didn't let them teleport wherever they wanted to go.
Exactly.
Right? You had to actually travel through the world to get to places. Our thinking at the time was, as I recall, that it would force people to, when walking, they might bump into people and have more chance interactions.
One of the books that was I remember that really affected me in the design of Second Life around those days was Jane Jacobs' book, which was called The Death and Life of American Cities. And she's this very famous, probably the most famous urban planner who, like you said, she basically said all the interesting stuff in life happens when you go from one place to another inconveniently.
Mm-hmm.
And all the interesting things are in that liminal, that transitional space between adventures. And like you said, we wanted to, we knew that there'd be this space problem. You know what it makes me think of? You remember, what was it? Active Worlds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we all played a lot and looked at Active Worlds when we were building Second Life. Or I remember like playing chess with Corey and just playing around with it. And the problem was that it could be very empty, like you were saying, because you could just spread out infinitely quickly, and everybody had this ambition to build more than they really needed to, and so you ended up with this very, very large vacuous space.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, we confined people to near the ground, and initially we made them walk everywhere, and then we had telehubs, right?
Right.
So what were telehubs? That's great.
Telehubs were these spots in the world where you could teleport close to those, and then you could walk to wherever you were going. So it was sort of like bus stop or something. And one of the ideas we had, as I recall, was we thought that the land around the telehub would be more valuable,
right?
With lower value, so it would create
That's what I was about to say.
A differentiation between sort of place.
And then what do you remember happening?
You tell me.
What I remember about Telehubs was that the land was more valuable, but that people used it in a kind of a Times Square or Minority Report sort of way to put advertisements for things, billboards all around for their stuff, for their stores or whatever. And so when you got to a Telehub, you sort of had to snake your way through all of these advertisements and stuff to go to your friend's house where you were going.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so after a while, we just allowed you to double click on the map and teleport. And of course, the world was getting bigger too.
Mm-hmm. And we let people fly higher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always thought that was kind of heartbreaking too, kind of going back to that tension between like a world whose rules are understandable that you kind of rage against to make it what you want of it versus everything's under your control. I just, and you're right, like that initial one big world where you had to walk everywhere or you could go to the telehubs, that's still what I kind of like. I still like the idea of a virtual world that would be quieter because you just have to walk everywhere. Or, you know, if there's a party all the way across town and you can't get there in time, you can't go to that party. I think in this day and age with the overwhelmed nature that we are in right now of too much information, it feels like, sounds good to me.
Well, some people will like that restriction and some people won't.
Yeah.
Most people won't. And so the pressure is to remove those restrictions.
Do you feel like, what do you remember being other examples of cases where we as the builders would really make big changes because of what people were telling us or what people were happy or sad about?
We haven't talked about the taxes. That was a mechanism we were using to
Sure. Yeah, that's a great one.
Encourage people to build down to the ground and also not build too much. So the way the system worked, as I recall, is it cost $10 Linden to make a prim, you would get $10 Linden if you deleted one. And then if you had prims out, there was a periodic tally would be made of where your prims were, how big they were, and how high up they were. And you would have to spend money to keep those in place.
And if they were a light or physical, I think.
Yeah.
It was like if they were expensive computationally,
mm-hmm.
like if it was a light or like if it had physics or whatever, those things cost you more.
Right. So it was an incentive to.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, what the tally was in the end. You couldn't tell. You would just get a number back. You couldn't actually look at something and kind of compute how expensive it would be. But this was a mechanism we were using to just try to guide people towards a more reasonable building and use of resources in the world.
And that was a great example of one that totally did not work out as planned.
Yeah.
We had a tax revolt. We had a tea party.
Right.
We had, we basically just confused the crap out of people because you would basically get this tax bill at the end of the week or something, or day or week, whatever. And you would get charged without representation, if you will. You would get charged Linden for, your built stuff. And I remember also maybe that I think you could also get charged for stuff that like you'd lost.
Yes.
I think there was, in the beginning, you couldn't find, like if you built something way off in some distant place, there was more public space and you could build something and you'd be getting charged for it and you wouldn't be able to find it.
That's right. We just gave you the cost. We didn't give you an itemized cost with locations. You could hunt it down.
That's so good. There's so many things in Second Life, that were just by virtue of the implementation or the complexity of them, they didn't turn out to be good ideas. And I think that was one of them where it still feels, again, like that idea of taxes was, in my mind, consistent with laws of physics, right? Like there are costs to these things. And so, nowadays we've got people with avatars that are incredibly complex, right? And so they put all this load on the servers and on people nearby when they show up. And it still feels to me like that is not in a balance that makes sense. You know, if that was part of an ecosystem of charges or whatever, that it would work better. Really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but people want to express themselves. So, and you know, with the tax system, new people would come in, and every new person would have to have the system explained to them. They'd have to figure it out. It wasn't intuitive, and it wasn't expected.
Yeah.
And so someone coming in today who just wants to, you know, have the 300 prim rhinestone necklace or diamond necklace that they wear, and whenever they cross region boundaries, those 300 items have to be
have to go across.
Streamed, you know, they have to be serialized and then deserialized on the receiving end. It's not obvious to the user that that's a huge cost, but it is.
Yeah, people don't understand the technical complexity of some of the things that are still in that's still in Second Life are completely unique. Like that idea of being able to roll a ball. I mean, I remember what I was so excited by was that you could roll a ball across the ground, and then it would cross over from one server to another, and on a good day, it would just keep running.
Yeah.
And you know, and it could have state, and it could remember things, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's still a pretty unique thing. What do you remember the gray goo thing? Like the
Yeah, I remember that.
What do you remember about that story? That was great. We added a feature, right, to let where you could reproduce. You could make an object, and then you could put your code. You could copy your DNA, if you will, into that child that you had made. And of course, that opened up the possibility of a viral attacks.
Yeah, right. So you could. We added the ability where you could give an object a script, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so you could write a script that would create an object and give a copy of the object to itself. You could give a script. Well, you could give an inventory item to an object, I think. And so you could give the object a copy of itself and a script that
would let it make more copies.
Copy. Yeah, and so that thing could then create another copy. And we knew when we made it, we knew that this was possible.
It's kind of like the current worries about AI, right? We knew it was only a matter of time until people began to use this feature destructively.
Yeah, lose control.
And then do you remember the first time that happened? Or I have this
I
one.
don't remember the first time.
We had that thing called the BigBoard from Snow Crash, right? Which was like a web page that would show all the servers' states.
Yeah, a map.
Yeah, and like when Second Life was comprised of only a few hundred, now it's like 15, 20,000 or whatever. But back then it was like you could kind of see it on one web page, all the little squares that were the little tiles of the servers. Mm-hmm. And what I remember was I was sitting there, a bunch of us were sitting there in the evening at Brannan Street, I think, our other office, and what happened was somebody said, hey, there's something going on in the world. And I was sitting at my desk, and I had the BigBoard, and I looked at it, and you could see this little cluster of servers turning red. And then the cluster started to expand.
Yeah.
And I realized somebody must have made an object that's reproducing itself. And it's going to shut the servers down, and it's going to shut all the servers down. The whole world.
Yeah.
And then what was really fun about that was I'm not, as you know from days of playing Counter-Strike together, I'm not a very fast, video gamer kind of clicker on things. But we had this feature on the BigBoard where you could right-click on a server and shut it down. And I started trying to make this firewall, fire brigade or whatever you call that, right? Yeah. Where I was shutting down the servers and trying to make a barrier, because we had an area that was like Australia or something, like it was connected in a fragmented way to most of the mainland of the world. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to start shutting the servers down and kind of cut off the peninsula so that it wouldn't expand beyond this point and get into the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And I succeeded in doing that, like before the replicating object made it across the boundary. And I thought that was pretty sci-fi. I was like, I still think that was like a pretty living in a real sci-fi moment.
I wasn't there for that, but after that, we had to write some tools to prevent the gray goo from taking over the world. So I was involved in that.
That's right, like the gray goo mitigation.
Yeah.
That's right. You were like leading that. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, there were several rounds or sort of sequences of work on that, but I wrote most of that code.
And it's like Google or something, because you still can't tell anybody how it works, because then if you told anybody how the mitigation code worked, well, then people could game it, right?
I think the residents have explored the limits of the gray goo containment system. They probably have ideas on how it works.
What do you remember? What else, what things do you remember people building early on or whatever that you were really like, okay, that's just next level?
Well, one of the things what I remember in general is every day or every week we were encountering really fantastic content, and there were moments where someone would be like, hey, come over here, look over my shoulder at what I found in the world. So that was just
fun.
All the time, people were just flabbergasted as to what the residents were building. And we were, it was always a very joyous experience. Even some of the terrible stuff, was just amazing. Like the gray goo, some of these gray goo attacks were impressive.
I remember there was an island that I liked that was called Svarga or something. And it was very pretty, but it had like organisms that were supposed to be like interacting with each other and breeding or growing or something. And I remember that being like a high point for me, because I felt like somebody had finally rebuilt that like Garden of Eden thing that I wanted, but on top of Second Life.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that being exciting.
Yeah, the beautiful builds. There was the white ivory tower. Remember that? The Prim.
Well, that's like still there.
Oh,
that's where I take people when I lead tours, actually a lot of times if I just go into Second Life, I'll go back to those old servers where I know which ones, the old alley named servers that were where it all began, which of course are still there, but nobody knows. I mean, some people know that, but it's fun to go in the world and take people back to there.
Right.
Do you remember the old like sort of Burning Man guy? Kind of there was like a statue of a big tall person kind of thing.
Yeah.
Rio de Janeiro kind of Jesus sort of statue that I think Ryan had made, and that is still there. So I sometimes go back and visit that statue. I think that's pretty cool that it goes all the way back.
I don't remember particular events that really stand out. But I remember it being very fun. We had the Burning Life events where people would really pour in their creativity and hours to make really neat stuff. Dynamic art, interactive things that you could walk through. Those were always really great.
It was always very recursive or self-referential, I thought, to do like a Burning Man thing inside Second Life, because it was kind of like Second Life was kind of like Burning Man anyway, and then you had a sub area in it.
And then there were the fantastic avatars. Like we had a alpha bug for a while, transparency layered bug, and so if you put a transparent object in front, I don't remember exactly how it worked, but you could basically make it so that you could see through
into your body, right?
Yeah. You could see through things.
Yeah.
And so someone had made an avatar that was they had like an X-ray screen in front of them.
Yeah.
And you could see through the body, but then they had put in the bones.
Yeah, the bones. I remember that.
And it was a great effect. Also, there was an avatar that was essentially an abstract painting, and they used this transparency trick to, it looked like a swirl of paint or something.
Wasn't that also like the ones that were cartoon rendering?
Yeah.
Where they would use that same thing where it was inside out, like you'd make it a little bit bigger, and then you color the inside of it black or whatever, and it would give you that, you'd see it only at the grazing angle.
Yeah.
Yeah. There were all those features like that, by the way, I think are another really interesting thing about virtual world design. which was that sometimes you make a mistake or something and then it gets used as a feature, and then because it's economically important to people and nostalgic or whatever, you can never change it again. And I think sometimes that's a thing that Second Life explored so much that other worlds and other designers haven't even yet encountered that problem, that if you build something that's really successful and large, people take advantage of every property of it, even if it's a property that you someday intended to change, like backwards triangles being invisible or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Misfeatures, we call them.
You know, along those lines of like strange things, people always ask me about like what surprised you, and I would always say, well, of course, I don't know, everything surprised me. That the whole thing was designed to be pretty surprising in terms of we were building something where people could build almost anything. But conspiracy theories in virtual worlds, I thought it was really interesting how at some point when we got to maybe 1 million people, or I don't know what scale, but I would start to get emails from people and they'd say, I know that you made this new change in some update, and it's because you're out to get me. And I would reply initially to people and say, oh my gosh, wait a second, hold on. That was just because we made a mistake, or we were dumb about something, or we did the best we could, you know, or whatever, right? But people would say, no. You had this nefarious reason.
I wasn't getting those emails.
Well, do you remember the FIC?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember the fetid inner core.
Inner core.
Yes.
So this, dear readers, it was a case where there was a group of people in Second Life who thought it was funny to revel in the idea that there was like a secret Illuminati of people that like had special access to the company or whatever, right? And they turned that into this joke. And I remember one time thinking that was so funny. Of course, this was probably not a good idea, but I remember thinking that was so funny that I had like a T-shirt or something that had like the logo of the FIC on it, and I wore it in like a Frontline interview or something like that, because I thought it was so funny because that people would see it and then they'd be like, oh no, the truth is out there, you know. There really are Illuminati. But I think the general human tendency to attribute something that you encounter to a purpose or a person in the sky or whatever, that's the thing I was struck by as being really unusual. That people would believe that there were intentional things going on behind the scenes that there really weren't. And so I guess in a way, as we got to this modern era where there's so much stuff that's like conspiracy theories, right? I guess it surprises me less now, because I feel like, well, I got to be kind of at the head of that, or experiencing that in an unusual way there for a while.
Yeah, I don't fully understand how, why the people need to spin these narratives, but it must satisfy some deep need, and we saw it early. I think the fetid inner core was also a complaint by some people who felt that there was uneven support going out. Like some people were favorites, some of the residents were favorites.
Right.
So it was a perceived unevenness of application of policy.
And philosophically, that seems almost impossible to avoid, right? I mean, you made friends in the world, so one did, we all did.
Yeah.
And so, of course, it'd be a basic human instinct, right, to be helpful. Yeah.
Right. And, there was sort of a popularity. Some people were just they had more friends, they were more vocal and sort of successful in the world, the social games, and they were succeeding and also becoming friends with some Lindens, and so there was a perceived inner group.
I wonder I wonder if anything, what speculation we can make about like what there is to learn from as unusual a place as Second Life about like social networks or social media as we now call it, you know? Like, what do we learn there?
Yeah, I don't know. We're doomed to learn the same lessons in new ways.
Well, one thing about Second Life that I'd be curious as to what your thoughts are, as we all know and as people have written papers about now, to a large extent, people in Second Life tend to get along better than they do on social media. That is, you know, they don't seem to become, for example, polarized toward each other. And I've often wondered, well, I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious as to what your thoughts are about why, you know, why that was, right? I mean, people definitely largely get along in Second Life, where it seems in social media that people are almost pre-tuned to diverge and, you know, get to dislike each other and be mean to each other.
Yeah, I don't know about that. There was a fair amount of griefing in Second Life early on. Still is today. So I don't know how friendly it is, or generally friendly in Second Life. It seemed very inclusive. What I think happens in Second Life is the people that, you know, come into grief but don't enjoy it, don't stick around.
Mm-hmm.
There's some people who come into grief and griefing is their sort of meta game, the reason why they come to Second Life, but they actually enjoy it, and eventually they become sort of pillars of some part of the community where they actually, you know, they enjoy Second Life enough to sort of defend it or, you know, support it.
Right. They find their own.
Yeah, but their game, their meta game, the reason they're coming, since there is no game, there's no score in Second Life, there's no way to win. You have to invent your own meta games, and some people choose griefing, and some of those griefers, you know, essentially become serious users of Second Life, and they like the platform.
And they feel a connection to their neighbors or to their friends or whatever, so they then become defenders, at least in some local way, of what the world is.
Yeah, and however, I've encountered even nicer communities online. For example, the fan fiction communities are very, for the most part, very supportive. There's very little flame wars or griefing going on. Acrimonious arguments for the fan fiction group. So this is where you write some short story based on some pre-established copyrighted work.
And then other people are commenting on it. You know, one thing that's different, that's similar between fan fiction and Second Life, and then different between those two and something like Twitter, for example, is that there is a primary focus on making stuff. There's a primary focus on creative contribution just by the very nature. I mean, in Second Life, as you know, it was because it's literally empty unless you make stuff. So you're going to make stuff, and then people are going to comment on what you make. And I feel like that idea of co-creation, like because there are nominally other people there, that idea of like co-creation of stuff is key to the thing that's kind of different from like more of a broadcast medium where you're mostly consuming other people's stuff, and then if you are commenting on it, you're like critiquing it, but you're not making in many cases you're not making your own stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like that. At least that takes you down a different path. I always think it's like leaning forward. You know, like leaning forward is engaging and making and doing, and then leaning backward is like relaxing, escaping, or whatever. You can be one or the other.
Yeah, and there's not really, I don't know, the Twitter, there's it's so public, and if you have an agenda, you can have your little Twitter wars. it seems like there's sort of less reason to have wars in Second Life because it's less public. It seems,
Also, like everything on Twitter is public by default to the whole world. So when you say something on Twitter, for better or for worse, you sort of have a sense, incorrect sense, I would say, that it's being read by everyone. That Joe Biden and Elon Musk are reading the thing you wrote on Twitter. And I think in Second Life, what was different, right, was that your voice doesn't carry very far. So you can be quite sure in Second Life, right, that no more than 100 people can hear you ever. Yeah. Even though there's 50,000 people online, there's only 100 that could possibly hear you.
Right. Yeah. And all those people have taken the deep dive, to make an account and know how to travel the world to experience the message you're giving in Second Life.
Yeah, and there's that. So there's not that many people that can hear you. And then on top of that, there's that symmetry where, like you're saying, they all had to build an avatar. They're all creative to some extent, right? Because they had to make choices about where to live and what to build and, what they wanted to do, what avatar they wanted to make. So that there's so much creativity that is symmetric going on. So it's like glass houses, right? You don't want to beat up on other people because you're making a lot of stuff too, and they're going to beat up on your stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Given that, what do you think, what have you not seen in virtual worlds? What would you like to see in virtual worlds that, we never got around to building, or that, you'd like to see happen in the future?
Well, I'm still interested in working on virtual worlds, but the first thing that comes to mind is for Second Life. The main item I've had on my list is collisions across region boundaries. And really this relates to working distributed physics systems.
Right. Tell us more about that, yeah.
We never actually got the boundary conditions of the physics simulation working in Second Life. So you can plop down an object at the border between two regions. Each region is running its own physics simulation, and you can see into the other one as a viewer in the world. But you can walk up to the edge and actually pass through objects that
are right there.
They're right there, but their center is, their position is in the other region, and so you don't interact with them.
Yeah.
You pass right through them. And that is a big problem. And back when we implemented the physics system, we thought we would just come in shortly and fix that. And we never actually fixed it. And that has been on my list of things to fix.
I remember a diagram with like particles or things at the edges of simulators, and like how one would be like a ghost, or you'd be sending this information back and forth. Yeah, I can remember like whiteboard diagrams or pictures of whiteboards or something that go all the way back to then that we were working on.
So it was in the plan, and then, the world got ahead of us, and we never went back and fixed that.
Does it interest you because you think you'd like to see things that are physical, that are like really huge or whatever? Like when you think about why you'd like to sort of solve that physics problem, how come?
Well, it's just a bug in the system, and it's affecting people all the time. And anyone building a bridge, or building highways or train tracks or whatever in Second Life have to worry about this. It's it's a leaky paradigm. If you've heard of the leaky paradigm.
I haven't.
In Second Life, there's physics, things bump into each other, so that system, but there's a problem underneath on how it actually works, and when that fails, the paradigm that you have in your head of like this is a physical world fails because of the details underneath. So the just the fact that you got to transport this information across between multiple processes, that bug reveals this structure that is happening underneath the whole simulation. And so just the fact that this bug surfaces, it needs to be fixed. So it's an item that I've always wanted to fix. I haven't got around to it. And hopefully eventually
it's been 20 years.
Yes.
It's only been 20 years. This June is going to be our 20th anniversary, of the release of Second Life, but not even of Linden World before that.
And we did different things at High Fidelity we had a distributed physics system.
Right.
And it also had its glitches. And some of those glitches related to the limits of the individual physics simulations. And we never actually got the boundary conditions working right. It's a complex problem, but it's something that, if I wasn't doing anything else, I would try to fix it. If I wasn't, if I didn't have a dozen other things to work on.
I think I agree with you. I think the broad idea, maybe it's because we both study together and we love physics, but I think the broad idea of building a physics simulation that can span many, many CPUs and is consistent, that you can do experiments and the experiments have the outcomes you expect. I guess it matches your prediction. And you can have complex behaviors. That does sort of feel like a holy grail kind of a thing, just to see. I've often been tempted to ask, how simple a world could you build that had those conditions and was interesting, we worked on this summit, High Fidelity, could you build a two-dimensional world that only had, collisions or something, a two-dimensional world full of marbles that could collide with each other and had different colors, and you could just move the marbles around and leave them places as a way of signaling people, and there's no avatars or whatever. I love that kind of question, and I think that the idea of a distributed physics simulation that worked is still very exciting to think about. I guess the question is, will we get to see it while we're alive or while we're still functional as designers and builders?
I do not know.
Did you ever think it would take so long to do some of these things? I mean, we started on this by comparison when we were kind of pretty much almost kids.
Early on, I didn't think so. I was optimistic. It seemed like the work could be done. It always takes longer than you expect.
It's like that guy, and who was it, like Rutherford or whatever, that they discovered the electron, and he said, physics as we know it will be over in 6 months.
Yeah.
And that was quantum, right? Or that was maybe it wasn't quite quantum, but it was like the
details of the atom.
That they knew there was something orbiting the middle part, and they were like, physics will be over. It's just a matter of writing all this down.
Yeah. Mechanical.
Yeah.
Back when they thought, the world might be completely predictable. Yeah.
Do you think virtual worlds tell us anything about the real world? I guess back to do we learn anything about the nature of reality from re-simulating it?
That's a tough question. I think my answer is no. When you really get down into the nitty-gritty of it, all the physics simulations that we do for games and virtual worlds are approximations. And maybe ultimately the real world is an approximation of something, but it's a pretty tight approximation. So you have to cut corners in order to do real-time game physics.
So you mean it makes you think that, if I'm getting this right, you're saying that there's always a degree of approximation or error or in, say, a virtual world, and that it also seems true that that's the case for the real world, albeit the tolerances are tighter.
I believe that's true.
I mean, do you think we're ever going to get all the answers to physics? We have things we still don't understand, right, about physics.
Yeah.
And of course, every year somebody says physics as we know it will be over in 6 months or whatever. Do you think we're ever going to get? Are we going to get a complete theory of everything?
Yeah. I don't know. It's possible that, maybe if they could just make a smart enough AI, it could figure it out.
It could tell us.
Yeah. So maybe we'll cheat that way and learn the fundamental rules that are at the very bottom. And then you got guys like Wolfram who claim that they already know what those rules are.
Right.
And
Although Wolfram, Stephen Wolfram in his latest work has kind of explored the way that computation and uncertainty and the phenomena of the observer may be sort of the same thing, and that there is a kind of as you said, there is a kind of an uncertainty to the specific experience that any one person can be having, that is deep, in the same way that I guess we would think of quantum as being sort of deep but also very poorly understood, right? And I think what Wolfram is trying to do is say, well, here's a theory of everything based on hypergraphs that even more explicitly explains why there is a kind of a limit to what you can understand. And there's entropy, for example, because you have only limited computation, and so you end up having to approximate things, and that looks like heat, as opposed to knowing where all the particles are individually. So he seems to feel like maybe we're moving almost toward knowing less, in a sense, or getting to a final answer where there's a degree of uncertainty that is, I guess, as Einstein objected to, just uncomfortable, that we're never going to get past.
Yeah, that's a very likely scenario, I think. But for game physics and real-time physics, you have to be very conscious about the approximations you're making to really understand it, I think.
Going back to something you just said, do you think that if the AIs give us a model of the universe that works better or works perfectly or whatever, will we find that unsatisfying? I think it would be kind of I don't know.
Probably because we wouldn't be able to understand it, right?
Even if we understood it, though, it sort of seems like having somebody else turn the cards over and tell us what's behind the door or whatever is kind of inherently unsatisfying. I don't know.
No, I don't think so, because very few people are at the forefront of understanding how fundamental particles or nature works. And essentially most of us are in that boat where someone else is turning over the cards. So whether it's some absolute whiz physicist that figures it out or some AI, it's the same to me. Someone's flipping the card for me.
It does seem, right, like when we studied physics, we all already talked about the fact that, right, like if you did undergraduate physics like you and I did, what you went on, like I did, we learned physics up to what, like 1930 or whatever. And then if you got your master's in physics, you got up to like 1960.
Yeah.
And then every incremental year beyond that became harder and harder.
Yeah. That became really clear to me in undergraduate upper level thermodynamics.
Oh, yeah?
Where they start talking about the relationship between entropy and number of states available, and basically connecting quantum with thermo. And I realized, wow, someone years ago who was an absolute genius spent his life figuring this out, this stuff that I'm learning, because this is really like amazing and complex. Someone figured it out and they spent their lifetime doing it, and the person who did that was smarter than me.
I didn't want to accept that as a young person, and I accept it now. It does feel, though, you're right, like I've often been struck by how great scientific minds, and I think Stephen Wolfram is one example, will sometimes have insights about things that they must know that they're never going to be able to really write this all down. That they're, or if they can, that nobody's going to understand anyway. And I wonder, as somebody who works on really complicated things, you know, yeah, you must have this almost sad thought or whatever that nobody's ever going to understand your work. And maybe for all of us that's true, like at some level, but for some people, like, you know, quantum physicists, it's truer than for most.
Yeah.
What do you think AI, what effect do you think AI might have on virtual worlds, given what we've seen circa, what is it, you know, end of May 2023?
Well, the ability of AI to dream up content really fast, really amazing content is definitely going to be used. But also maybe I could imagine eventually we could have AI actually do the physics, right? Like the physics engine. The physics engine would be an AI prediction system.
Right. So instead of simulating the physics with collisions and whatnot like we do today, you could just tell an AI to say, tell me what you think happens next.
Yes, exactly.
And you don't have to worry about not the math, but you don't have to worry about the collisions.
Yeah. So here's the input, what's the output?
So physics, so AI replacing a physics engine and maybe helping us get to that distributed system kind of stuff too.
Yeah. One of the things I've been messing around with in Second Life right now is trying to do inverse kinematics. It's one of my side projects. And
so tell everybody what that is. That's
inverse
like the
kinematics
joints.
is where you you know where you want the hand to be, but you don't know the
rest, right?
You don't know the angles of the bones that get you there. So you're like your hand is trying to reach out and grab a point. Calculating the angles of all the bones,
all the other
bones,
joints.
Intermediary, is a problem of inverse kinematics, rather than.
So you've been working on that.
Yeah, and so it's definitely, you know, it's a tough problem. There's always little glitches to work through. It's a lot harder than you think it's going to be, but it's solvable. You know, just by writing the logic through and doing the math. But as I've been working on this, I've been thinking, well, if I could just get an AI, if I could just train an AI to calculate the inverse kinematics for me, then I wouldn't even need to know how it works. Just as long as the AI always gives me the right answer. So maybe AI will be used to, you know, do inverse kinematics for all of your local avatar animation.
I saw an Unreal demo. Maybe I'll look it up and put it in here or whatever. But I saw an Unreal demo that was doing the muscles using an AI, and that was pretty impressive. Where it was moving the muscles so they'd have a skin, and then they'd be simulating the muscles underneath it, and you could, you know, make the avatar go like that or whatever, and it would stretch all the right muscles that would be necessary to move the arms or the body that way. I thought that was pretty cool, and it was being done with AI, and as like we were talking about earlier, we both know that wouldn't be feasible, you know, really in any way other than doing something like that.
Right.
What about, I think using AI to like make 3D scenes, while on the one hand you don't get the craftsmanship or whatever, the pleasure, if you will, the suffering of building these things with these little primitives, but I do think that idea of like typing text like you do with Midjourney or something, but having the output be a three-dimensional space, I mean, come on, that's going to be bonkers when that starts happening, because we both know, because we've worked on it so much, that it's extremely difficult to build content. Like building things in 3D can only be made easier with software up to a point, right? It's incredibly hard to do well.
Yeah, but it just occurred to me that maybe if you had a predictable AI, you could use the AI as a form of content compression, right? If two people participating in a virtual world, if the viewer has an AI that can interpret the prompt and produce all the output, if you want to convey what a scene looks like, you can imagine the server,
Mm-hmm.
someone gives a prompt to the AI to produce content, and they try
saying.
different prompts until they find what they want.
Yeah.
And then they can communicate that whole scene with a properly formatted prompt that can just be sent to the other side.
That's cool. That's cool. So you're saying there's this kind of data compression where you say, we're in a woods with a cabin and smoke and a stream and fish and birds.
Yeah.
And you can say all that as what? Like what I just said was like 300 bytes of text, right? And then it makes that whole scene. And so if you had a deterministic AI that was doing that expansion, it would be like compression.
Mm-hmm. But you could even imagine, creating a space completely original.
Mm-hmm.
And then it might be possible to ask an AI, given the known receiving AI and its state, what is the prompt? What's the smallest prompt that takes this, like study this scene, and reproduce that scene with a compact prompt?
I think that's one of those non-reversible problems, though, maybe. But yeah, like the complexity of that might be.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't get it exactly, but you could imagine you could get it pretty close.
That is a wild
right? Because you could say, like, this house is styled like.
Yeah, so it's this prompt
it's a house
plus these twiddles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe the description is many sentences long, but still a lot smaller than all of the data that would be in all the textures and the finer details of the scene.
That's great. Like, I love like using this as a design session. Like, that is an interesting invention, right? Like that idea of using it as a compressor. I mean, I'm always troubled by that we will build worlds that we don't live in with each other. Like, I'm a broken record on this, but I think that if we share places together that we've built, but that we're both seeing the same thing, it makes us get along and like each other better. It's one of the things that I think has made Second Life peaceful in some ways too, is that you're in a shared space, and so you feel a bond with somebody because you're in that space, like the bond with the last names.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry that AI will enable, in a couple of different ways, it'll make it easier for people to kind of live in their own world, but not each other's worlds, Like one is that, it could become so easy to create content that you're just like, I don't know, always creating so much content that was just uniquely yours, but nobody else has seen your content or whatever because there's just so much. Another problem is like talking to AIs instead of talking to people. Like, it feels to me like if you're talking to AIs that are pretending to be your friends, we're going in a very, very dangerous direction there. Not because the AIs are necessarily going to do us any harm, but because you're communicating less with real people, which means you're going to maybe like those real people less or not understand them or have conflict with them. And so it feels like we need to, I think, really consider that as we think about how AI impacts things like virtual worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe that. I haven't thought it all the way through, but I could see that.
So kind of as a last thing, or sort of maybe wrapping up here a little bit, since we're running out of light in San Francisco here, you've always been a very kind of kind, helpful person as a character at Linden Lab. I mean, I can say this, many people watching this probably do know this too, but what advice would you give to like people that are getting into engineering or software or whatever in terms of how to get along with each other, since you've done such a good job of that in your career?
Well, thanks for the compliment. I don't know if I have any good advice on that, actually. When I think about my own methodologies or attitudes, processes, what I always come to actually is one of the things that you told me about, which was the 5 love languages,
mm-hmm.
right? So there's there's
a
self-help book for relationships, and I guess it's been spun off to many books about all sorts of relationships.
I think it's pretty old. Yeah.
The first one was about marriages, how to make your marriage work, and
well, that's the one I think. That's the only one I know.
Well, they have ones about how to use the love languages, say, between parents and children or something like that.
Right.
But anyways, the short story is, theory is there are 5 primary love languages. Everyone likes to give and receive messages in these languages, but everyone has a primary one that's most important. And so if you want to save your relationship, you figure out what the love language of your partner is and start to speak and also accept messages in that love language. Everyone should read the book. The book's longer than it has to be. Like, it could be a 10-page.
And what are those there? It's like touch, quality time, acts of service, gifts,
and
words of affirmation.
Words of affirmation, right.
Those are the 5.
So you turned me on to the idea that my primary love language is acts of service.
Yep, I remember that.
And so I read the book. It was a good book, but one of the things I came away from the book with was, yes, my love language is acts of service, but it also allowed me to justify my tendency to give acts of service. That is, not only could I understand why I would tend to help people with projects, help people out if anyone had an emergency, help them out, but also it becomes justification for doing that. I can say, oh, my primary love language is acts of service, therefore I should be helping this person out. And so that has been one of the practices that I've picked up since then.
That's great.
But advice for so like when I think about, like, my first thought on advice for people would be like, you just want to help people out. You know, if you are
help
helpful,
people out,
if you're helpful in your environment, then everyone's going to want to have you around. But I know that that kind of advice, I would give that advice because I value helping people. And it might not be everyone else's primary love language. So I'm not sure that advice would apply to everyone. But that's the advice I would give. That's the immediate thought of advice that I would give for people if they want to succeed in the world in general. Is
understand what other people need, and then in the case where, for example, providing them with help, acts of service, do it, right? Do it and recognize that it's a key component to getting along. I think one of the things that helped us all in our work was that Second Life was such a complicated undertaking, and one that was what do you say nowadays? Cross-disciplinary. Cross-disciplinary. So we needed computer graphics, physics, and scripting, and all these different things, avatars, all these different things that we had different people with different backgrounds. And so one of the things that I think naturally fell out of that, and like people like you were really like beacons for that behavior, was that you had to help a lot of other people out more maybe than you might normally in a company. I think about Silicon Valley companies as sometimes being like built around one key innovation or one key person's remarkable capabilities, and then you build, the layers of an onion company around that person or whatever. But this was something different where none of us had all the answers. We were more generalists than most, and so we had that opportunity to be good to each other.
One of the things about Linden Lab was, for much of its early period, Linden Lab was a fantastic place to work. Like, for most of the people, everyone was enjoying themselves, and it was very rewarding. Even later, when Linden Lab became better, it was still a good place to work.
Became bigger, you mean?
Yeah, when it became bigger and more people, it was still a good place to work. Maybe it wasn't quite as, just tight-knit and rewarding as the early days. But there's when the early like the rise of Linden Lab, there were a lot of really great people, and they still have close ties, and still remember those days. And that's what that community, the internal community of the company bled over to the product, I believe.
Right. So that's a good point. Maybe that was something about the experience of the world too. Yeah, was that it carried over. I mean, I think that, like you say, having a bunch of people that want to help each other, like what you said earlier, right, engaged in an interesting and considerable undertaking is a pretty good starting point. Like, it seems kind of hard to screw that up. Like, if you're if you're looking for hope, which we all need these days, coming up with something to work on that is complicated and interesting and difficult and has to be tackled by a whole bunch of different people who have, different mindsets and skills. Like, that's a pretty good recipe, right, for a company, or, it starts you from a good place.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great.
It's been my pleasure.
It's good to talk to you this way.
Yeah.
Thanks.